Hi, everyone. Welcome to the People and Culture Essentials videocast, brought to you by, of course, the People and Culture Association. I'm Jonathan. I'm the coordinator for the PCA, and we're really excited about this. The first videocast for autumn. Though, speaking about autumn, it suddenly got hot in the UK, or just as we got into the autumn. But we're really excited about this one. We have Rory Moore joining us, of course, with David Liddle. We of course have these videocasts almost every fortnight now, and we have some fantastic conversations with individuals joining us from different parts of the world. So what is the PCA? Sometimes people ask us, and the PCA, or the People and Culture Association, is basically a membership think tank for individuals and organizations pushing forward the people and culture function, finding different ways to make our workplaces better, those moving from HR to people and culture, those trying to move from HR to people and culture, and those who have already moved to people and culture and making it work. So we speak to different individuals who contribute, because we realize that people and culture is so much more. It's not just HRM, it's not just human resource management. We come from different angles, different professionals contributing to this massive change that we are seeing in the modern workplace. So feel free to use the chat box, or rather the comments box, on both on LinkedIn and YouTube. Drop your comments there, drop your questions for Rory and David, and we can quickly get started. But I want to introduce first of all Rory to all of you. Of course, you already have been following on LinkedIn, but he was nominated for the Forbes 30 under 30. He's currently the sustainability chief, the manager for sustainability and corporate responsibility at Ericsson. Of course, he received awards from the UK Prime Minister and United Nations. He's a global sustainable. He's also gotten a Global Sustainability Leadership Award, and is a keynote speaker in 5 continents. If you're not following him yet on LinkedIn, I will be sharing the link with you soon at the kicker at the bottom of your screen, and you should go there and check that out very soon. Rory, thank you so much for joining us on this video cast. Of course, Rory is going to be speaking to David Liddle, who is the CEO and founder of the TCM Group and the president of the PCA. Gentlemen, I now hand over the mic to you.
Jonathan, thanks so much. Rory, a very warm welcome to today's People and Culture Association PACE videocast.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to talking to you.
No, likewise, man. What a fantastic career! What a CV that and accomplishments that Jonathan was talking about. I'm really excited to discuss some of that with you, find out more about the whole sustainability agenda, and also find out a little bit more about your journey into this area. But just to kind of get us started, Rory, perhaps you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey so far.
Sure. So I've always been quite interested in sustainability as an area. I think I can trace that back to actually when I was 16 or 17. My first forays into this space was sort of in advocacy. So I joined the UK Youth Parliament, as I was elected to the UK Youth Parliament when I was in 16, 17 years old. And that involved meeting with members of the cabinet in the UK government, talking about issues that matter to young people. And that really opened my eyes to a lot of the problems we face in society, and specifically with the environment. And I think then I was just really interested in social action and sustainability. And when the pandemic started, I was studying at LSE, at university in London, and I wanted to do something to help others. And so I started a volunteer organization in the area where I was living, and then scaled that around the world to become the world's largest volunteer organization during the pandemic, and took some insights from that to advise other organizations. So the Prime Minister asked me to advise the government here in the UK on volunteering strategy. And I've also worked with large corporations and family offices, helping them to navigate, understand why sustainability matters and how to take action on that. And now, as was mentioned, I work for a large corporation, telecoms company, Ericsson, helping them with their sustainability and corporate responsibility agenda. So it's been a very interesting journey from advocacy through to organizing and starting this organization for volunteering, through to advisory, and now working in-house at a large corporation. So certainly a lot to unpack there.
Wow, there's an awful lot to unpack. It'd be kind of really, it's phenomenal from a very, very early age in the UK Youth Parliament, and a real activist. I was curious to know about the voluntary work through the pandemic. What did that involve? Was that around the whole piece on sustainability, Roy?
What we were trying to do is just provide any support we could at the start of the pandemic. I'm sure everyone can relate and remember it was quite chaotic, and we didn't quite know what was happening. And we just wanted to help people with small tasks, whether that was, for example, doing their shopping, if they were isolating, not everyone could get deliveries online back then, taking someone's dog for a walk if they were isolating or unwell, or even just chatting over the phone to prevent loneliness if someone was living alone during that time where they couldn't socialize with other people. So we were just trying to help people with basic tasks. And we started that by just in the area where I live, delivering flyers with our names and phone numbers and saying, if you need your help, then just give us a call. But we realized that wasn't very scalable. So we ended up actually using and building a mobile application that people could download and use geolocation to connect volunteers and those who needed help around the world. So we did that in 40 countries across 6 continents. We had around 50,000 volunteers at peak. Wow. So we started in rural Surrey, where I'm from, and ended up being the world's largest organization for volunteering during the pandemic. So it was certainly not what I had intended to create, but it was a great learning process, and it was really, really rewarding to be able to create that kind of impact during a time that was really difficult for a lot of people.
Oh, that's fantastic. I mean, has that continued beyond the pandemic? Is there anything that's come out of it subsequent to now that we're hopefully coming out through this now?
Of course, we managed to build a really strong network of people that wanted to volunteer and wanted to help out. And the way we see it is that regardless of the public health situation, there's always a need for community volunteering and also integrating technology into that. Because generally speaking, the third sector, charities, NGOs, have not embraced technology as much as the private sector. And so we really see an opportunity there for driving digital connectivity and using the power of that to transform the way that volunteering is done. Specifically with that organization, due to funding constraints and also my own personal professional activities, it was not possible to carry that on. But that community we still have, that community of people who are interested, and we are driving the conversation as well on how digital technology can be used in volunteering. That's part of the work I was doing with the government, and also, generally speaking, engaging with different stakeholders in different countries, and really trying to push this message about digitalizing the third sector. So it's a large piece of work, but it's definitely not over yet, and we want to take the insights we have from what I did during the pandemic to see meaningful change in the longer term in this sector.
And of course, now you're working in sort of a tech company, so you're kind of continuing that theme around the relationship between digital technology, people, and planet. What role do you think digital technology plays in the whole sustainability agenda, and how do you think that kind of supports the activism that you've been demonstrating so far?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's quite interesting because digital technology is both a drag and also an opportunity, in the sense that if you look at a lot of the companies that are digitally enabled, they are consuming large amounts of electricity. Even software companies, you just look at the rise of generative AI. The compute power needed for generative AI is 10 times what was happening before. And so that's using a lot of resources. But at the same time, it has the potential to allow companies to, in real time, monitor and optimize their energy emissions, for example, with smart devices. So there's this sort of conundrum where digital technology is clearly the way forward in terms of driving a more sustainable world. But to get there, the process might be somewhat regressive at the start. So it's just about navigating that. So there's definitely, I see that digital technology and this sort of area is the key way to create a more sustainable future. But at the same time, that alone is not going to do it. We still have to get buy-in from all sorts of different stakeholders, whether that's people in government, people in large corporations, because it's a collective action problem. If one country or one organization has a fantastic sustainability agenda, that's not going to fix climate change, because we rely on other stakeholders in different places also taking action. So technology is an enabler, but it's not the only solution. We also have to get people on board, and that's also a very complex task.
Absolutely. Well, let's kind of focus on that sort of broader piece around sustainability. I mean, we're kind of seeing the B Corp logo appearing on more and more organizations, which of course is fantastic, raising the profile of this. And we're seeing kind of sustainability, as it should be, a key focus for many boards, management teams, and organizations more widely. Sometimes one wonder, and I kind of hope we can get into this in terms of the real strategic focus on sustainability. But in sort of broad terms, what do you think sustainability means to organizations, and what practical tools and remedies can organizations be focusing on to help protect the very fragile ecosystems within which we all work, live, and play?
I think it's a good question, and in fact, one of the big questions that is gone unanswered is actually just what it means. There's so many different terms that are banded around: sustainability, corporate social responsibility, sustainability and corporate responsibility, ESG, all these different terms, and quite often they're used interchangeably, even though they actually do really mean different things. So I think, although it sounds perverse, one of the big challenges we face is actually figure out what it's called and what it is we're trying to do, because that is a prerequisite for organizations to take action. But specifically what that looks like, I think, for example, at the company I work for, we split it up into 3 pillars. We have the environment, we have digital inclusion, which is education and allowing organizations to, allowing connectivity in different parts of the world. And also finally, corporate responsibility. So that's more around employee engagement, volunteering, human rights in our supply chain. So it's a very broad topic. In reality, previously, I think businesses viewed sustainability as a nice to have. They had their core operations and then something they were doing on the side, which might be a marketing piece. And there was pushback from stakeholders in the C-suite saying this is not something we should be prioritizing. It's a cost sink. But we've seen radically in the last kind of 5-10 years, that's really changing, and that's accelerating too. It's not just a nice to have now, it's sort of business complement. And what I mean by that is it's actually tied to success of organizations. And this is something I spoke about a lot with companies when I was advising them on sustainability, is that having a sustainability strategy can actually be good for your organization, not just in perception and impact, but also in the business. For example, looking at your energy saving, you're looking at energy emissions or your carbon footprint. If you optimize that, you can reduce your costs. Or equally, if you have a sustainability strategy, that research shows that young people are more likely to want to work for you because they see you're committed and you have a sense of purpose. They're therefore less likely to leave your organization, so that can save money too. So there's all sorts of ways, and I could go on, but this is essentially what I'm trying to say, is that it's not just something that should be sitting on the side and it's like a thing that should be a marketing piece, but actually the case for executives is that having sustainability at top of mind really can drive results for your organization and improve the bottom line, not just be a cost sink. So that's a key takeaway, I think.
I think I absolutely agree with that. I think the challenge for business leaders, look at the decline of Wilco's, the constriction of the UK economy through July, a small retraction in the size of the economy, that our business leaders and organizations are focused on so many different areas. And I see sustainability as a key priority, but fighting for headspace in the boardroom against other priorities, of which economic growth, shareholder value, sustainability of the brand versus sustainability of the planet, and almost these conflicts. How do you manage the prioritization of sustainability over some of those other business factors, and then retain that? Because again, making sure sustainability isn't just the buzzword of the current period, and then it falls back and replaced by something else, whatever that might be.
Yeah, so I think one of the key cases for making to drive the constant presence of sustainability is that business case that I mentioned. Obviously, if you're working in your organization and you pitch to your leadership team that you should launch this education program or this climate initiative because it's going to make the world a better place, that's normatively nice, but it's not going to get the support or the buy-in. It's about demonstrating the business case, saying this is how it's going to improve our brand value, and that's the consequence of this, or this is how it's going to help us to attract and retain the best talent, or this is how it can optimize cost savings and impact the bottom line. So that's one thing, making the business case and driving that forward, because that appeals to the stakeholders you're trying to convince. And the other thing is that actually, not is it just becoming imperative for consumer-facing companies or enterprise-facing companies because customers or people are looking at and wanting to procure services or goods from companies that have this strategy in place, but also the regulatory environment is something that is somewhat neglected by people outside of the industry. We see constantly, every couple of months, we're seeing new laws coming online in different jurisdictions requiring companies to increase how they report around ESG and how they report their initiatives. A big piece of legislation coming up in the European Union next year is the CSRD. And that basically means that a lot of companies that aren't really doing much now are going to suddenly have to give detailed reports on their supply chain, on their own activities. And so the regulatory environment is meaning it's becoming imperative. It's not just, oh, should we do this because it's a marketing play, but actually you now need to have a really good handle on what your organization is doing and what its supply chain is doing, because that's going to become a requirement by law to report that. And also access to finance nowadays. Investors are increasingly trying to measure your ESG scores and therefore make decisions. So it's not just that it's nice to have or it can have business value. It's also going to become a prerequisite for operating in some jurisdictions or even attracting finance in others. So I think for those reasons, it's something that executives cannot ignore anymore.
Absolutely. And that's such a really interesting point, the relationship between business, the state, regulators, of course, the local communities that we all work and live in. So it requires quite a complex relationship between those elements. And you've worked over your career in different aspects of each of those. What more do you think could be done? I suppose the question I really wanted to ask you is, are you optimistic, Rory, from what you're seeing, that all of those different aspects are linking together to deliver a real focus on sustainability? That was the question I really want to ask you, is, are you optimistic? And the second question I wanted to ask you is, what more can be done to manage those complex interrelationships between state, regulator, business and community?
Yeah, so I think firstly around the sentiment question, I do feel pretty optimistic. I think for various reasons, that if you just look at the trends we're seeing, which are obviously primarily driven by external pressures, as in what the customers or consumers of an organization are thinking and saying, and that's obviously driving what they do, or the regulatory environment that I mentioned. And so we are seeing companies increasingly take this seriously. In some countries, there's still a narrative that ESG is somewhat of a woke, if you want to use that term, which I really hate.
I've seen
I think the people who are saying those sorts of things are fundamentally misunderstanding the whole concept. But we'll get into that later. But so I think generally I'm optimistic if I just look at what's happening in the market, and also geographically too, because one of the other things we've seen in the previous 5 to 10 years is that it's a Western construct, and that it's being driven by Western companies. But it's some really interesting use cases coming out of Southeast Asia and indeed East Asia and other parts of the world too, that show that it's not just something that's happening in Western world circles, but also other parts of the world are following this too. So, and as I said, if we just have change happening in one part of the world, it's not going to be sufficient. So the geographic scope and also the trends that we're seeing mean I'm pretty optimistic about the way this is going. And the regulatory environment, although condoned by some or condemned by some, I think is actually helping as a catalyst, because companies no longer have a choice. They have to look at this stuff. Now, that's a much bigger question over what the role of states or institutions is, but it's certainly having a catalytic effect in terms of driving change and progress in the right direction. And to the second part of your question about how we manage all these different relationships between private sector, public sector, other types of organizations, it's very difficult, because it's a fast changing conversation with and it's hard to compare between different organizations too, because they're using different metrics, different data. When it comes to reporting, you use one framework in one company, another in a different one, and it's hard to actually compare the two. So there's still challenges which are trying to be fleshed out and solve. But ultimately, I think it's about dialogue and involving the right stakeholders, because the government can't make laws. The government or international institutions like the European Union, for example, if they make laws without business being on board, then there's going to be a fundamental disconnect. Or likewise, if business makes decisions without involving the regulators, it's just going to lead to a big mess. So there is already good work happening where businesses kind of working groups and roundtables that are bringing together these different actors, because in reality, if one is not on board with the other, then it's not going to work. So I think the only way forward is to make sure that as decisions are being made, all stakeholders have a view. Of course, it will have to come to compromise. Not everyone will be able to be happy, but I think it's much better to do it that way than for a government or an institution to say this is the new law, and the businesses turn around and say we can't do that, or it's not going to work, because that just breaks down trust. So I think all decision-making process needs to be collaborative and also involve the right people, and then you probably get to better outcomes.
Okay, I mean, I've spent 30 years in my career, Rory, working in the area of conflict resolution, and more latterly in the area of cultural change and cultural transformation. But the language you're using around dialogue, engagement, compromise, building trust, and creating those spaces within organizations and more widely within our society to allow people to come together and talk about their various interests, look at where those interests compete or are more aligned with each other, is a really powerful way of actually driving not just a shift on sustainability, but actually creating a powerful workplace culture within our organizations, which then sustainability feeds into. And I think for me, the greatest impact we can have is where sustainability and the conversations that you're describing here become normalized within the culture. So my next question really is about if the culture of the organization is sort of developed by our leaders, and we're talking a lot about leadership here as well, but also it's the climate that our managers and others create within our organizations, what more can we all be doing to drive the sustainability and sustain that kind of cultural norm within our organizations to help create a positive, better workplace for our people and, obviously from today's conversation, for our planet?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and actually it ties in very closely to something I've seen in my work in recent times, is that quite often organizations, they don't now need to be told that sustainability is important, they know that, but then what they will do is they'll create a sustainability function or department.
Yeah.
All sustainability matters will sit in there. So you have business critical functions and a sustainability function.
Silo.
Exactly. So to create a culture of sustainability throughout the organization, it's not going to work if you just say, here's the team, here's most of the team, the business, and then here's the sustainability department. Of course, you do need to have that division for the way it works internally, but to create the culture, it has to go beyond. You have to create this kind of, it's like a collective action thing. It's not just something that one department will deal with, but in reality, you want sustainability to be embedded and integrated into all decision making. So when organizations are deciding, which companies to work with or who to hire or what the strategy is for these sorts of things, you need to have sustainability in mind in all those different things. And to create that culture, it's obviously not something you can do overnight, but I think it's really important to focus on how we engage the right people, how we bring the right culture on board. And in reality, that will look different per different organization. But the thing I want to get across is that it's not just the Department for Sustainability will handle everything externally within the company, because you also need to drive education and engagement internally so that every decision is made with sustainability in mind. And that's a difficult thing to do, and it hasn't been done particularly well or in particularly much depth in any companies that I'm aware of, but it's certainly something that we will see more of in the future, because to create a really sustainable organization, you can't just have one department that does it. You need to have that culture throughout. So that's definitely something that we will have to look at more in the future.
I think so. But to your point that you raised earlier around the business case, and that if this is good for business, then it becomes a core feature and a core capability within the organization. I think as I hear it, you're talking about the kind of integration and the planned and predictive and model of deploying sustainability in our organizations. I was listening to a really interesting piece on Radio 4 yesterday about the electrification of cars, car batteries, and how China has spent the last 20 years investing in battery production, and now obviously employ electric car production. And actually then, where the majority of electric cars actually already, Tesla's cars produced in China, the majority of electric cars are likely to be being produced from China, which of course throws up geopolitical challenges. And it does throw up some really interesting points around that notion of it's siloed within the organization to becoming fully integrated, and then using that integration to drive competitive advantage for our firms. I just wonder, you're obviously working for a global organization. I know you can't speak for the whole organization, Rory, but just looking at the role of business and commerce and using sustainability as a competitive advantage, are we in the West falling behind, or is there more we could be doing? Or again, to that sentiment, how do you feel we're doing?
Well, I think at least in the industry I work in, we do see that sustainability can be a competitive advantage.
Yeah.
Particularly because we are a supplier to most of our customers. And so that dynamic means that our customers' emissions, their scope 3 emissions, i.e. their value chain emissions, are relying on what we're doing. So our customers are always asking us questions about what sort of initiatives we have in place, and also technical details about our products, because we're ultimately a hardware company. So the products that we make, our customers want to know, about their supply chain, about the supply chain of those products, and also, what are the embodied carbon emissions and so on. So we do see questions, but the reason it becomes a competitive advantage is when our customers launch tender processes, and we're amongst other companies competing for those contracts. Then we see that if you have a solid environmental strategy in place and can really account for the details of the footprint of your products, that then gives you that advantage over others. So certainly in industry, at least the one I am in, we do see that having sustainability strategy is not just a nice to have, it's now critical, because it's related to our overall success in what contracts we have and what we don't. To your broader question of like the geopolitical or the geographic divide, I think this is something that we're still not entirely sure about, because different industries and different geographies have different requirements relating to environment or other matters. And it has, as I mentioned earlier, traditionally been something that's prioritized in the West. But in reality, a lot of companies now are multinational companies, and just because they might have their headquarters in one country doesn't mean they're not impacted by reporting requirements or regulation in another jurisdiction. So again, the regulatory environment is then having an influence, because if one company has to, let's say a company is based in China, but they have really strict reporting requirements in the EU, they might start doing that reporting in the EU, but then think, well, actually, I might just do it as well in the other jurisdictions. So it's sort of having a catalyst effect. And so I think in the future, in the short to medium term, we will see that regardless of geography, the focus on sustainability is the same, just because of these global dynamics and trends, and the fact that it's becoming a requirement in a lot of places. So I think I'm, again, relatively positive about this area.
And you mentioned the ESG work. Let's put that to bed. I think you have done well and truly. I mean, you kind of, if I'm persuaded about the business benefits here today, then I don't know what it would take. But you mentioned people perceiving the environmental social governance agenda as a woke agenda. I think we've deconstructed that and demonstrated it's completely not. But just leaning into that comment and that thought, because I think I'm seeing it, you're presumably seeing it as well. What would you say to anyone who does see the sort of striving towards social justice, as you've described, the environment, the digital environment, the CSR focus, that the purpose of the firm is about generating wealth for the shareholder and not addressing issues of sustainability or social justice, or driving what might be described as a woke agenda? What would your reaction be to that? Were you to ever hear anyone mention that to you on a podcast?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is, as I mentioned previously, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of what these terms mean. So for ESG is related to metrics that you can record and report. Again, ESG is this supposed evil concept of companies trying to make the world a better place or whatever. But ESG in itself, in pure terms, is often misunderstood. It's essentially, measuring specific metrics around your contribution to the environment or for other social things, and being able to report those. And in reality now, to get investment, big private equity houses, or indeed venture capital investors in some cases for more advanced rounds of raising money, are interested in your ESG metrics. This is not something that is being forced on by nefarious actors. This is actually the markets, right? Investors want to understand this information because they see that companies that have more sustainable metrics are, by definition, more sustainable. It only takes a short look at the news nowadays to see that there's some really tragic events occurring. And you have to be able to map this risk, but also have policies in place to deal with it. Because when that arises, if you have the right approaches in place, then it means you're going to be more robust and resilient. So the first thing to say is that ESG is misunderstood. It's reporting, and it's being driven by the markets. So it's not something that's being imposed by any one ideological actor. So that's probably one of the defenses of ESG. More broadly, with the CSR agenda, or whatever you want to refer to, sustainability more broadly, the idea that companies should make the world a better place and do good as well as maximizing profits. As I've mentioned previously, the way I see it is that companies can do both, and it's not a question of doing one and having to do the other because it looks good, but actually the two are completely intertwined. Partly because there's a business case for doing everything, like I mentioned before, whether it's reducing your carbon footprint will also save you money. In reality, there might be a short upfront investment to change that, but in the long term, it will pay off. But also, if some industries you're working in might actually be affected massively by climate change. And so by taking action now, you're going to protect your business as well. So I do see the critics. I understand they have their points, but I think it's a combination of misunderstanding and also just perhaps the wrong mindset that means that they don't quite see the same way. And obviously everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but it does frustrate me when people criticize the so-called woke agenda, because in reality, companies are one of the key, private companies are one of the key stakeholders in our society. And we do want to see the world become a better place for our kids and our grandkids. So they have an important role to play, but also it can drive better business benefits for them. And the ESG reporting side is something that's being driven by the markets, not by some ideological institutions. So I guess those points, I'll leave it there, but that's essentially what I think about this.
Yeah, well, you've made a fantastic argument. I think we've probably already established that, but I think, Rory, thank you so much for addressing that so fully. Curious, Rory, kind of your job sounds fascinating. The work you're doing sounds fascinating. What's a typical day look like for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's now slightly now that I'm taking a full-time job. Before that, I was doing a range of different things. I spent some time living in California, actually working in the generative AI startup area in Silicon Valley. But then really a typical day does not, thankfully, it's never the same. It's always quite varied. So it's a range of things. I do a lot of advisory work, both like for businesses, but also pro bono for nonprofits, because I recognized that when I started my organization, I had no idea what I was doing, and I was sort of just making it up as I went along. And so I try and give insights to other people who are doing something, whether just starting, whether a bit more advanced, try and help people to improve their impact, because I recognize if I can help another organization make the world a better place, then I'm doing my bit and paying forward the insights that I have. Also, I do a lot of speaking, partly to children, in schools and universities. Again, trying to encourage them to be good citizens and to make the world a better place and to do things in their communities, but also a lot of executive focused work, again, around making the case for sustainability, or where the case is already understood, giving concrete tips as to how they can action that and how they can take what steps they can take to make that happen. So it's a mixture of advisory, speaking, and other ad hoc things that come up. So it's really, I'm very lucky because I get to travel a lot for that kind of work, and no day's the same. And I've met a lot of really interesting people and had really interesting conversations in different places. So yeah, it's very enjoyable.
That sounds amazing. I'm going to ask you a question in a moment about those insights that you're drawing from working with young people in schools and elsewhere, but also maybe working with sort of older generations, and maybe any differences or similarities that you see and any key learning points and insights drawing from there. But I just want to kind of draw attention to one of the accolades, the Forbes 30 under 30. You achieved that at the age of 21. So massive congratulations, great recognition, obviously from Forbes, and kind of interested, what did it mean to you to achieve that recognition and that accolade? And what does it say about you? What can you tell us a little bit about it and its and your leadership style and your values as a leader? I think they're coming through actually, but just what did it say and what did it mean getting that achievement?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, it was obviously meant a lot to me to get that award. I did not expect it. I mean, the average age of people on that list is around 27, and I got it when I was got it 3 days after my birthday, having just turned 21, I think. So
wow, amazing.
I was very, very fortunate. And actually, although you can't really see it, the image behind me is like various other people who've been on the Forbes list, and you've got the likes of Mark Zuckerberg and Lionel Messi and Rihanna and all sorts of really interesting people. So I can never quite believe that I'm in the company of those people, but I have the image on my wall to remind me. So no, of course, it's a great honor, but also I would say that it's helped me in my own professional work as well, because it opens a lot of doors. I think that's somewhat problematic that you have this badge that then opens doors, but it's allowed me to further my work. Various speaking opportunities, advisory, and connections that wouldn't have been possible without that. And I do think that's problematic because lots of people do great work, better work than me, and it doesn't get recognized. But that's a whole conversation for another day. So yeah, of course, it meant a lot to me. And just to give a bit of context, essentially, the list is 30 people under the age of 30 who are the leaders in their respective industries. So I was in the European list. There's one for US, one for Europe, and one for Asia. I was in European list for social impact. So there's 30 people which under 30 who are identified as the kind of leaders of the social impact industry in that continent. So obviously it meant a lot to me to get that award. And I guess to the second part of your question around the leadership style, for me, I think it's quite interesting because obviously I'm relatively young, and quite often are leading teams where there are people who are a bit older than me, or quite a lot older than me. So I think I just have to try and for me, it's about empowering people. And if you I've also seen this myself, that being in teams where other people are leading, I've seen what works and what doesn't. And I think if having a really top-down approach, having someone who's leading and saying, do this, do that, is really not going to work. I try and involve and create this dialogue where everyone can contribute, obviously you have to have a sense of direction, but it's not just about me saying you do this, you do that. It's more about making collective decisions, involving people, and having an open conversation, because in reality, if people don't like the idea of what you're asking them to do, or don't want to do it, then the outcomes are not going to be good. So for me, it's about creating a culture where people feel, prepared to and feel happy to speak up and identify problems and be involved in decision making, because again, organizations where people are involved in kind of the strategic and the whole purpose of the organization, then they feel more empowered and will be more productive as well. So I think those are probably the things that I've seen that work best. But of course, I'm still not a perfect leader. I still got a lot to learn. So I'm always open to changing based on the way on the experience I've had, and see what things work and what don't, and optimize my own approach based on that.
Well, I think everything that you're saying there is so inspirational and insightful. Empowerment, engagement, dialogue. Being less autocratic and more empowering for individuals. There's the empathy, there's the altruism that's running through the narrative here. So clearly, that focus on social justice, so apparent. What I sometimes, when I meet leaders who share some of those core values, they get designed out as we go into our organizations, the organization's hierarchy and the structures, and the culture sometimes in the organization doesn't value those approaches. And many leaders would aspire to what you're saying, though, Rory, in terms of those values and those principles, those core powerful principles that you bring, but the organization doesn't value them. I just wonder, have you got any examples? Have you ever found your values and principles in conflicts, and how do you manage that to ensure that you stay authentic to your own and true to your own leadership style?
Yeah, I suppose some of the projects or some of the work I've been involved with has been very time sensitive and time pressing. And although you have this rhetoric and desire to want to include everyone in decision making and create this culture, sometimes obviously it's harder than others. And as you say, lots of people come in with a set of values they want to follow, but then in practice, when it gets to the actual execution, it's difficult, of course. So I have found it, particularly during some of the work during the pandemic, because things were moving so quickly, and there was a real imperative to take action to support the people that we were working with across these different countries. It was always easy to have considered decision making. Some of it was essentially crisis decision making, because things were changing quickly. We were facing a new regulatory pressure or directive in certain other, because you have to remember we're operating across 40 countries and 6 continents. Not only was the COVID situation different, but for example, the laws on what you could do, what you couldn't do. In the UK, I'm sure you remember every week it seemed like there was a new rule or something that we had been different than the previous one. And we had to navigate across 40 countries to ensure we were complying and acting responsibly. So in response to these things, we did have to make decisions quickly sometimes, and wasn't able to be as collaborative as we would have liked to be. But I think although there might be temporary situations where you can't follow your whole value set, as long as you keep that in your core and remember that, then and use that as a guide rather than as a manual you have to follow for every process, then it will still keep you true to the overall approach you want to have, even if you can't always follow it. So I think it's a good point, but not everyone can always take the approach they want to, but ground themselves with a certain value set, and that's at least a good start.
Yeah, and you talked earlier, Rory, about your work and going out to schools, doing talks with young people, and also within what you're doing. So you've been in a I would think, a fairly unique position to look at all of these various perspectives on sustainability and hearing people. I'm sure you get lots of questions being asked and people sharing their thoughts and reflections. So just trying to sort of get a sense from your perspective, do you see differences on a generational basis? Are there areas of consensus that you see that are forming, or areas of divergence or dissonance that you observe? I'm just curious to hear a little bit about some of those reflections.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you only have to look at the contrast between. I'd say I do probably, although I do all sorts of different talks in different categories, I could probably put them into 2 baskets. One is people, i.e., university, schools, youngish professionals, and then executive audience. Which on average, given their position, is quite a lot older. And with a young audience, I mean, it's something we've seen in research and polling that's reflected that, generally speaking, young people care more about the world, partly because they have longer to live in it, but also it's just the new generations tend to be more socially aware because of social media and other things. But certainly something I've seen reflected that I don't have to convince people that, we need to do something about climate change, or that, we have a responsibility to do as individuals to take action. That's something that's already internalized, it seems, with young people. And the question is not, oh, why should I do something? It's how can I do it? And that's really refreshing compared to talking in many cases to executives where it's a question of, I don't care, why should I listen to it? So that's something that's definitely apparent. But again, it's worth pointing out this is not just something that varies across age, but also across geography. And I've dealt with, particularly on the executive side, people in different geographies where there's a really different perception of sustainability. I did a lot of work in the past few years in the Middle East, for example, where we're seeing a massive growth in terms of awareness around sustainability, which is great, but originally it wasn't so strong. And of course, some of the largest companies in the Middle East are petrochemical companies and companies that have, overall not a great impact on the environment. So the conversation was not an easy one to have, but they're becoming increasingly aware of that. So that's good and it's changing. But the point is that between young and old, or young and middle-aged, and then also different geographies, there's always going to be different statuses or positions on these issues. But that's part of what I'm trying to do. My mission is to educate people and not lecture on why you should do it or how you should do it, but more make the case, as in not lecture them on they should do this because it's great or whatever, but to try and understand their needs and make the case for it in a way that appeals to them, because that's the only way that after you leave the room, they're actually going to take any action if they see what's in it for them. So we ultimately we live in an individualistic society, not an altruistic one. So you have to make a case that appeals to people, to their own interests. But that's part of the strategy, and that's part of the way of change on this issue.
And that helps you, I guess, prepare for those kind of big conversations across cultures, across geographies, across generations, is understanding that people come in with their different interests, their different aspirations and goals, and trying to understand those, and then hopefully find some space where they can come together. It sounds, and so much of what you've been saying, because again, I listened to so many of these interviews through the sort of lens of, or looking through the lens of a mediator, conflict resolution, dialogue, peace building, which is the area I come from. And so much of what you're talking about in terms of helping to drive the sustainability agenda and get people talking, creating a discourse, leans heavily from so much that I've learned through my work in Peacemaker. It's just an interesting. I suppose there was a question fighting to get out there, Rory, because the passion, enthusiasm, and expertise comes through. Where does it come? Or what inspired you? Is there a moment when you were growing up, or maybe just going back to where's the fire which is burning clearly? What lit it?
It's a good question, and it's one I get asked a lot. And originally I wasn't quite sure, but the more I thought about it, the more I asked it, I probably do have a bit more of an actual answer now. And I think it's also grounded partly in my own upbringing, because I was very fortunate to, have a really supportive family and go to a good school. And in reality, the school I went to was somewhat in a bubble, in the sense that, you weren't really exposed to other people's problems outside of that, which I think is potentially problematic. But given I started this whole social impact journey in advocacy, like I mentioned, I found through going to meetings on my local youth council and then being in youth parliament in the UK, it really exposed me to a lot of injustices and issues that people faced. And the more I thought about that, then I thought, well, I've been really lucky to have the education I have, but not everyone's had that. So how can I not just use that to further my own gains, but pay that back and support other people? And so that's where I started realizing, okay, there's a lot of inequality, a lot of issues that we need to do something about. And the more I got involved in advocacy, the more you become aware of these different problems. And I think that was really the kickoff point for me, thinking that I wanted to do something. And when I launched the volunteer organization during the pandemic, I realized that if you put your mind to something and try and solve a certain problem, you can really have a big impact. The sky's the limit. Just because you're in a certain place doesn't mean you can't impact other people elsewhere. Yeah. So I think that to me has served as a case that I realized, okay, I can do something. I just have to put my mind to it. And I thought, if there's no better mission than trying to make the world a better place or support other people. So that's what I want to do. And when I left university, I was really lucky to have some offers from really great, well-known companies to go in as a graduate. But I just realized that I personally wouldn't feel fulfilled, because I didn't feel like I'd be making an impact. And I always think of this model of marginal impact. And that's where if I was not to take a job at this other company, as a certain company, they would find someone to replace me who would do the exact same thing. You're just a person who will do the tasks, and your impact there's no marginal impact. Whereas if you can go into a role where you can actually, strategize, innovate, and do something different to make an impact, then that's a lot more rewarding for me. So I think it's just that upbringing that I had and the experiences, particularly in advocacy, which exposed me to these various issues, really made me think, okay, I know what I want, and it's not just to be a cog in a big corporate wheel that does not really drive change. Yes, I know I'm working for a large corporation now, but it's not the same thing in the sense that we really have in our team the scope to define our initiatives and make a real impact. So I find that a really good opportunity because we work at scale. We're in 180 markets. We have over 100,000 people. So there's a real scope to make a big impact. And that's my main mission.
Wow. I mean, people sometimes ask me what is purpose-driven leadership. I think you've articulated that beautifully. I'll probably have that as a segment and play that for people when they ask me that question. Because I think leading with purpose and helping others to then align to that purpose as well is so self-evident you're doing around the sustainability piece, but also around the equity, around the inclusion piece, around that social justice piece as well, which are all feeding into and part of that whole sustainability agenda as well, which is absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much, Rory. It's been really an absolute pleasure meeting with you. I found it deeply inspirational. I think both you as a person and the journey that you've been on, but also the key messages that you've brought. And I just wonder, looking ahead, we are experiencing, tough times, from a sustainability perspective. For sure, people are worried about climate change. You shared your optimism, your hopes, your ambitions. What do you see the future being, perhaps for yourself, Rory, and for the sustainability agenda as we perhaps look over the next 5-10 years, which I think, being not pointing too fine a point out, are probably the critical moment for us as a planet and as a species. So maybe just taking a moment to look forward. What does the future look like for you and this agenda?
Yes, I think for me, I'm as you've clearly identified, I'm very passionate about sustainability and this issue more broadly, and I think it's something I want to continue to drive throughout at least the next 5-10 years of my career, if not for the whole career. And indeed, the sustainability function as a job is growing massively. I think there was a report out from the World Economic Forum earlier this year saying the number one growing job is artificial intelligence engineer. Second most growing job is a sustainability specialist. So I'm confident I'm in the right area, but it's not just that. It's also I know that I want to do something and continue to make an impact through whatever means I can. So planning to very much stay in this area. But more broadly, the trends for sustainability looking forward, I think we're going to be seeing much more regulation. I mean, there's a lot coming online now, but there's going to be much more, which will affect a lot more companies. So I think actually one of the biggest challenges is competency building, because right now in some countries, like any organization that has over 50 people employed for them are going to suddenly have to next year start reporting on their supply chain, on all of their initiatives and these sorts of things. So right now, we don't have the capacity necessarily to do these sorts of things, but it will become a necessity in going forward. So I think we'll see more regulation. I think we'll also see more geopolitical divides. Obviously, there's a big narrative at the moment around competition between the US and China, and they have differing outlooks on some matters. But contrary to a lot of the media and news you would consume, China is innovating a lot and trying to really tackle this issue because it's important for the country, not just it's not just something that's nice to do, as a lot of people say. It's actually something that China is looking at seriously. So, but it will become an area of competition, because the country that can invent, advanced carbon capture techniques and methods, or advanced technology for solving some of these issues, that's a $1 trillion market. So it will become an area of geopolitical competition, which is something to be aware of. Particularly given we try through international institutions to tackle climate change. You have to look at COP, for example. COP28 will be coming up later this year in the EU. So there's a lot of challenges, but I think that generally speaking, if we sat down 5 to 10 years from now, the world would be in a better place. But there might be a few obstacles along the way that we have to navigate. But generally speaking, the way I see it, things are moving in the right direction.
Wow, Rory, thank you so much for sharing that positive outlook, the optimism, the passion, the enthusiasm, the expertise. the drive that you've brought to the videocast today. It's been an absolute pleasure, Rory. I wish you all the very best in your ongoing career. I'll be following very closely, and I hope one day you'll come back and tell us a little bit more about some of your achievements as we're going forward. But Rory, from all of us at the People and Culture Association, thank you. And I'd like to say also we have a social value project at TCM and the PCA called TC Love. So we'd love to donate a small donation. It's only £100. Rory, but Jonathan will also be in touch after the video's concluded, just to see which charity you'd like us to donate and make a small donation, like I said, of £100, just by way of saying thank you for giving up your time so generously and sharing your insights and wisdom with us today. But Rory, from everyone at the People and Culture Association today, thank you so much, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
You're very welcome, and I'd love to see that picture behind you. I think that's what a hall of fame.
Yeah, I'll be sure to share it with you afterwards.
Thank you very much, Rory. Thank you everyone for attending. I can see a message there of Mary. Thank you very much for your message. Okay, thank you, Jonathan.